In this video, I want to show you how to have a successful interview podcast. I just started one a couple months ago. I've done 14 episodes, so I'm definitely a newbie, but I feel like I've had some pretty successful interviews, and I have a very clear process that I follow. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do everything from deciding which guests to invite on your show, how to invite them, how to schedule the interview, how to record and edit the interviews, and how to make sure that you're doing all of it and keeping up with all the pieces so that you can have a successful interview show. So if you're looking for tips and advice on how to get your interview podcast started and going strong, then keep watching. If you're new to my channel, thanks so much for being here. My name's Lane. I love to help online entrepreneurs and aspiring self-publishing authors get their message out into the world and make a great income doing it. So if you're into that kind of thing, be sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if it gives you value. And by the way, if you're starting your podcast, I highly recommend Buzzsprout as a host. I've used other hosts before, including Libsyn, which is a big, well-known host. I much prefer Buzzsprout. I talk about why in this video here, but if you use my link below, you'll get a $20 Amazon card when you sign up to a paid account on Buzzsprout, and that is an affiliate link, so I get a small commission in return. So if you're going to host a podcast anyway, check out Buzzsprout because I think you'll really, really like it. Also, if you're looking for gear on how to set up a podcast, I have a whole video here on everything that I use tech-wise. But in this video, we're going to talk about the process of getting people scheduled for the interview. What I want to do in this video is show you the process that I have for how to schedule people I want to interview, and then how to get them on the show, how to successfully record it, and how to make sure I don't drop the ball at any step of the way, because I'm dealing with people who I want to respect their time. I want to communicate that I value them and I value their time. And in some cases, these people are way more important than I am, and I don't ever want to communicate that I am flippant about their time or whatever. I think that's really the first thing that you have to understand if you're gonna jump into doing an interview podcast. It's a pretty massive commitment. You have to be ready for it. So the first thing I want to suggest when it comes to choosing your guest is to get organized for how you do it. Now, I am working with a virtual assistant. I have a 5-hour-a-week virtual assistant. I talk about the process of hiring her in this video right here. But she helps manage this process. But you could do it on your own. I just choose to have someone else do this for me because it's just so much easier to manage. So I have a simple spreadsheet here where I have the name of the people, what church or organization that they're a part of, because my interview show is largely pastors and church leaders. I have their email. I have these blocked out just for their privacy, but then also their title, and then the status of the invitation, and then some notes. So my VA will go through here and she'll invite guests, and then she'll let me know if they're in step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 of the process. Now, what do I mean by that? We have this process for inviting a guest onto the show. Now, I got this from a friend of mine. I was on a podcast called the Unseminary Podcast, hosted by Rich Birch, and I was on there as a guest. I was on there a couple of times, and I was so impressed by the process of how they took me in as a guest and walked me through this process of being on the show. I reached out to him when I started my show and I said, hey, can I borrow your content for that? So I want to give him credit, but basically we adapted it. So Frankie, she is my virtual assistant. She makes initial contact and emails potential guest. Okay, this is step 1. This is the subject of the email. This is the content of the email. And so it gives a little bit of background into who I am. You want to do that when you reach out to somebody who may not know who you are, and somebody who is an expert in their field. You want to let them know, you want to do a little bit of credentialing. Like, hey, I'm not just some rando. I do have a bit of a social media following. I do have a YouTube subscribership, and I have written books on this subject, and I want to have you on as an expert contributor. So Lane asked me, that's me, Lane asked me to reach out to you because he would be thrilled to have you as a guest on the show. We're looking for conversation about practical tactics that are helping you preach and or lead with greater impact. So I want to make this email scannable. I want to get to the point about what I'm going to be asking them to do. Now, the next thing that happens is they are given links. One is this link, which is Calendly. If you're not using Calendly, I highly recommend that you get on Calendly and you use it to schedule your meetings. I don't have an affiliate link with Calendly, although I guess I probably should because I love it so much. But they're on here and they can schedule me at whatever time works for their schedule. And once they put themselves on my schedule, they know that it's an hour and I've got all the information here. So we use this tool, we book for 60 minutes, the interview will last about 45, and then they're given the guest planning form. Now the guest planning form is also in that first email. So the guest planning form looks like this, and this is what they're given. So this helps really well because they're able to put in their name, their last name, their email, and then I have a set of questions that I ask them. I highly recommend this because what this does is it doesn't have to dictate your interview, but at least gives them an indication of where the interview is going to go. It gives you an indication of what kind of quality or what kind of distinction they're going to have with their interview. How is their interview going to be different than your other interviews that you've had? And sometimes what I'll do is these things will stick out to me, like they'll answer in a certain way and I'll say, oh wow, I definitely want to talk about that. And so then once we get on and we're starting to record the show, before I press record, they're sent this by my VA ahead of our thing, just so they'll have their answers. And I'll say, hey, I really liked how you answered this question here, so I'm going to ask you about that, and you can kind of go from there, and then I'm going to ask you about this, and then if we have time, we'll cover this. Is that okay? Does that work for you? And typically in 14 interviews, it's always been, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go. Let's do it. So that really helps a lot. So that's step one. If the person responds, in step one, if they say, yeah, absolutely, and they fill out the calendar invite, they fill out the guest planning doc, then that's awesome. We're good to go. That doesn't always happen though. Sometimes we don't get an answer. Sometimes they say yes, but they forget to fill out the guest planning form, or they forget to fill out the Calendly invite, like all of the above. All those kind of things happen. So we have a step two. Potential guests should schedule time on Lane's calendar as well as fill out episode planning form. If no response on these, Frankie to send follow-up email, otherwise move to step three. So if they don't respond, we have a follow-up email, all right, where she says, hey, I wanted to follow up about being on the show. Take a look at this calendar. Thanks for considering it. So basically, Frankie is able to just copy and paste this direct content, put it in there, and send it to the person. Step three, so Frankie to confirm with guest that info has been received if the date picked is several weeks or months out. Prompt them as necessary if they haven't filled out both a time on Lane's schedule and the episode planning form. So we're excited to have you on the Preaching Donkey podcast. We see you've booked an interview, and take a few minutes to fill out the guest planning form. Then we move on to step four, 2 to 3 weeks before the interview, Frankie to email guest to confirm details and see if they have any questions. So she's just emailing them and saying, hey, and by the way, right here where it says, could you take a few minutes to fill out our guest planning form? If they've already done that, she changes it to, thank you so much for filling out the guest planning form. We have that. And really appreciate that. So we're just acknowledging to them that we got your guest planning form. Step 5, Frankie to email the guest the day before with details. So she sends the day before the interview, she reaches out and says, here's what you can expect. We'll structure it around your answers. We're looking forward to you being on the show tomorrow. This is really important because sometimes people schedule things and they just completely forget that these things are even happening. If you can, having a computer plugged in with internet connection is better than using Wi-Fi. If you're on Wi-Fi, don't worry, but a plugged in just kind of, here's some ways to make our situation better. Use a smartphone with earbuds if you can, or use a microphone. That would be even better. Look forward to your interview, and then insert the Zoom link. So she puts the Zoom link there so they can just immediately click on it. 1 week after recording, Frankie to send a thank you email to guest. So she sends it. She says, hey, thank you so much for being on the show. The day the podcast is set to air, she'll email and says, you're being featured on the Preaching Donkey podcast today, so-and-so. And then there's a link to the Buzzsprout link, and there's also a special link to the YouTube show, so that YouTube link, so they can go watch it on there. So those are the steps, and it may seem like a lot, but here's what I have found. Sometimes these guests will schedule a show 2 or 3 months out. So having a little bit of back and forth is not bad, so that it stays a little bit on their mind. Some of these emails don't have to happen. Like once the planning form is done and the scheduling is done, we skip some of these steps and just set the reminders. But it's really helpful to have this process, and it's very high touch and it's very personal. And that's why I like to have a VA do it, because otherwise I would be tracking these things all the time and it would wear me out. So this is one of the reasons why I hand this part of my business off to someone else, because I just like to know that it's being taken care of. She will blind copy me on these emails so I see them coming through and I just know that it's happening. And it kind of reminds me, oh yeah, so-and-so's coming on the show in not too long. So I want to talk about interviewing. Briefly, the technical side of things, I use Zoom because it's just so easy. Everybody is on Zoom at this point. Everybody knows what it is. Nobody has to learn a new software or have a special username or anything like that. They get your link and it's ready to go. So that's a huge deal. I have a Pro Zoom account so I can record for as long as I want, and I just get on the Zoom call with them and we set things up. Typically what I'll do is I'll chat with them for a little bit, kind of make sure that technically we're good, everything's coming through, the levels are good. I do a little bit of, hey, how are you? Not a ton, because I'm dealing with people, again, who are busy and they didn't get on here to chat with me, but I do want to be personable. So we get on there, I talk for a little bit to make sure everything's good, and then I just set the expectation. Hey, here's what's going to happen. I'm already going to have talked about you. This is one of the things that I mentioned. Before we get on the interview, I will have said, hey, my guest on the show today is so-and-so. They're the pastor at such and such church, or the leader of such and such organization, and they've done these things, and they're really impressive in this way. So all that kind of stuff has already been said. So once we get to the interview, what I say is, hey, so-and-so, it's so great to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for being here. And then they respond and say, hey, thank you, Lane, for having me on the show. I can't wait to get started. And then we dive into the questions. We start with a few questions about their background and history, but then we move to the questions about the tactics and strategies that they use in their leadership and their preaching, which is really the substance of the show. That's how the interview goes. I will say a couple things when you're interviewing somebody like this. One, you have to discipline yourself to really listen to what they're saying, because the tendency when you're interviewing and the show is kind of on you, the tendency is to wait till they finish talking so you can be sure to ask the next question, or you can keep the show moving along. But really the gold nuggets, like the real essence of a good interview, comes from actually listening to what your guest is saying and pulling things out of that. Some of the best content on my show had nothing to do with the planning form, had nothing to do with anything we talked about ahead of time. It's things that came out in the conversation that I was able to say, hey, I want to talk more about that. You said such and such. Let's talk about that. Tell me more about that. Be very curious. Like the best way to interview someone is to really listen, to be very curious, and to keep asking the next question. Tell me why. Tell me more. Tell me about. And give that person an opportunity to really share deep, so that your show isn't just the same as every other interview that anyone's ever heard from that person. You want to dig deeper. The other thing I would say is try to avoid talking too much. This is a huge tendency that we have when we host a show, because if you're like me, where part of what I do on YouTube is I'm giving advice and tactics and strategies and communication coaching for pastors, then the other part is where I interview people who come on and do that for me. They do it as my guest. And so on the show, I'm not the expert. They are, but there's a tendency to want to be perceived as the expert. There's a tendency to want to say, oh yeah, I know that too, and I thought that too, and I've had that insight as well. And that really stills the thunder from your guest, and it's kind of rude. It's kind of rude to come across like, oh yeah, you had that idea, but I had another idea too, and my idea is great. So the way to avoid that is just allow your guest to be the star. Allow them to be the one that really shines on your show. And then when the interview is over, because I record these ahead of time, and then I have a little bit of solo time before the interview, and then I do a little bit of solo time, meaning just me, after the interview, where I wrap it up and end the show. And that's typically where I will give comment to something that was said on the interview. I'll say, hey, when the guest said such and such, that made me think about this principle. And I'll be able to kind of be the expert and really serve my audience. It's not just about being the expert. It's about serving your listeners and your viewers and making sure that you're drawing the best part out of the interview. But while you're interviewing someone, let them be the star. Don't try to steal the spotlight. You brought them on. They're your guest. They're the ones that you have this one opportunity to let them speak into your audience and to share with them their expertise and insights. And don't try to take that away. And then lastly, I would say stick to the allotted time. You never want to go over the time that you've asked people to give you. So I asked for 1 hour. Typically, my interviews are about 45 minutes, but I definitely watch the clock. I'll be taking a look at the clock and I'll make sure that I'm not taking them a second over the amount of time that they agreed to give me, because they might have other obligations and I don't want a reputation for abusing other people's time, especially my guest. That is the process that I use. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is what I'm doing at this point. And there's a couple of videos popping up on the screen right now that will really help you if you're looking to get into podcasting or leveling up your gear with podcasting. Let me know in the comments what questions you have about having a successful interview show, and I will see you in the next video.